Today we are going to be discussing probably the most compelling and popular reason why people give that Jennifer Crumbley should have never been charged with any sort of crime as it relates to the Oxford school shooting that her son carried out. Now remember, this is a landmark case. This is the first time in history where parents are being charged with any sort of crime as it relates to crimes that their children committed. So we really have to get this right, and we really have to think about this because every single jurisdiction is going to have to deal with these type of questions. We already see that this is happening in Georgia. We're going to most likely continue to see parents being charged with some sort of crime as it relates to crimes that their children commit. So every jurisdiction is going to have to deal with this very, very important question. Can we charge parents? So the argument in the Crumbley case goes the following. We know that Jennifer Crumbley's son, we're going to try not to mention his name, her son, who carried out the Oxford shooting, was charged and convicted as an adult, which means, generally speaking, a minor cannot be sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. If that kid's a minor, then that's the general rule. Now, there is a way to depart from that general rule, which we're going to get into today. And we're going to see how this all plays in together when it comes to charging Jennifer Crumbley. And if you even are able to charge Jennifer Crumbley with anything. Because the question goes the following. If the shooter was charged and convicted and dealt with as an adult, how can we then turn around and charge his parents for anything? How can we charge his parents with one of the theories in the case was that they did not control their minor child? So which one is it? It's a complete contradiction. If you're going to charge him as an adult, how can you say that the parents had responsibility over him as though he is a minor? And this is the dilemma. This is what a lot of people are coining the ethical dilemma, a moral dilemma, a rational dilemma. And a lot of channels and podcasts have been talking about this specific question. But the way that we approach this specific question, as you know, if you're a follower of this channel, if you're not yet, please definitely subscribe, that we look at this through the lens of the case law in Michigan or whatever jurisdiction we're in. If we're in Massachusetts, then we look at the case law in Massachusetts. If we're in Florida, we look at that case law. So you have to see, and this is what we do on this channel, as a lawyer, as a judge, the way that they're going to answer this question is not just how they personally think about it and how they personally rationally think about a specific topic. What they do is they look at the case law that has been established. They look at the statutes, and then they apply the law that they find in the case law, and they apply to this specific situation, either comparing it, contrasting it, distinguishing it, showing that they're similar in one way or the other. And that is how legal scholars analyze a specific topic. So that is how we are going to approach this specific question. How can we charge Jennifer Crumbley and convict her for not controlling her minor child when we charged that child as an adult? And this is such a strong and compelling argument that the defense attorney for Jennifer Crumbley actually argued this in his motion that he just recently filed, arguing that she should be acquitted. She should be let out. It's not fair. It's a violation of her due process. Now, there was a motion that he filed, and we already went through a number of the arguments in his motion about why Jennifer Crumbley should either have a new trial or she should be acquitted. Number one is that they argue that there's a Brady violation, a Brady/Giglio violation. We discussed that in a previous video. If you haven't seen that yet, definitely go check that out. There's another argument that they make that Jennifer Crumbley never really had any legal duty to the children, the students at Oxford school shooting, and therefore the whole premise of involuntary manslaughter falls on its face. So we discussed that in a different video. Well, today's video is just going to be analyzing this specific dilemma, this question of, is it even possible to charge a child as an adult and then expect the parents to control that minor child and then charge them for not controlling their minor child? Before we jump into the case law, and there's a lot of very interesting cases that govern this, before we jump into the case law, I do want to remind everybody that I am still slated to skate in a charity hockey tournament. And I need to raise some money for that hockey tournament. So if you're able to, there's a link in the description. The charity is called RCCS. It's an organization and charity that helps out families that have been stricken with cancer and their entire lives are falling apart, and they need some support, they need some hand-holding, and that is exactly what this organization does. They come in and they help provide the support and guidance that these type of families need. So everyone has had family members or friends that have been stricken with a terrible disease like this, and they know exactly what that does to a family. So any amount is appreciated, and it'll help me. I need to raise a certain amount of money in order to play in this hockey tournament. So help me out there. The link is in the description. Whatever money you can donate is great. Thanks a lot. Now, let's move on to this part of the motion that Jennifer Crumbley's attorney argues about why this specific issue is a problem. So let's pull it up. And this is this part of the motion and brief. Okay, the prosecution denied the defendant's right to due process by asserting inconsistent theories insofar as the prosecution charged the shooter as an adult, but at the same time charged the defendant for failing to control her minor child. The court should grant judgment of acquittal based on the violation of Mrs. Crumbley's due process rights. Everybody recognizes due process rights. It has to be a fair process. So that would include not charging the son as an adult and then the parents as though the child, that it was just a minor child. So, caused by the prosecution's assertion of inconsistent theories of criminal liability arising from the same event. In particular, the prosecution charged Mrs. Crumbley's son as an adult, and he was convicted and sentenced as an adult for the crime of murder. At the same time, the prosecution's case against Mrs. Crumbley was premised on its assertion that she failed to control her minor child, giving rise to involuntary manslaughter. These theories are both factually inconsistent and mutually exclusive, amounting to a violation of Mrs. Crumbley's due process rights under both federal and state law. Now, here's an important question, right? We always look to the state law. This was a state crime. It was committed in Michigan, so therefore she was charged in state court. That's why her trial was in Oakland County Circuit Court. It's a state court. It's not a federal court that she was tried under. So you have to look to the Michigan case law. Now, what does Michigan case law have to say about this? Well, here is where it becomes a little bit of an issue because Michigan has not really adopted this position. So let's see what it says. While Michigan has not yet adopted the position that due process is violated when the prosecution offers factually contradictory theories during the prosecution of co-defendants, our appellate courts have cited federal case law establishing a federally secured prohibition on inconsistent prosecutorial theories of criminal liability. So what he's arguing is the following. Although Michigan case law has not specifically said that you can't do this, to offer contradictory reasoning, theories to convict two different defendants, which they're saying is what's going on here. You have contradictory theories. On the one hand, you're charging the child as an adult, and then you're saying, turning around in Mrs. Crumbley's trial and saying that the child was a minor. So that's contradictory. So you can't offer contradictory theories. Well, their argument, that number one, the defense is saying that Michigan really hasn't adopted that specific position just quite yet. Maybe it will soon, but it hasn't kind of done that yet. But what the Michigan courts have done is that they cited to the federal case law. Remember, there's two separate bodies. There's state and there's federal. So they cited to federal case law, which does stand very clearly for this proposition that you cannot, as a prosecution, offer factually contradictory theories during the prosecution of co-defendants. Now, co-defendants is a very important word here. Okay, co-defendants mean that you are co-defendants in the same crime. And then the question is going to be, is this the same crime? Because really, technically, they're being charged with two different crimes. You're right, the facts of the crime are very, very similar, but ultimately they're being charged differently. They're not both being charged. The parents aren't being charged with first-degree murder and terrorism, right? So that's something to think about. Okay, but let's just go through what he has to argue about this. And by the way, the last time I checked, the state did not respond to this motion yet. When the state does, we'll take a look at that and we'll see what the arguments are with respect to all the different arguments that the defense is making, but they haven't said anything yet. So the state's still working on their response. So this is, again, the defense's position here. All right. So we have to see what they cited to the federal cases about when it comes to contradictory theories. And this is just a quote from a federal case, Clark versus Warren. This court and others have held that the due process guarantee is frustrated when prosecutors use contradictory theories to secure the conviction of two persons for the same crime. Remember, same crime. Okay, let's continue. People versus Clark. It appeared that due process was considered violated when mutually exclusive or factually contradictory theories were advanced against co-defendants charged with the exact same crime. Okay, so again, we're seeing same exact crime. More recently, and that was People versus Clark, which is actually a Michigan case. More recently, our Court of Appeals cited with approval the Eighth Circuit's decision. So again, you have the Michigan Court of Appeals citing to the Eighth Circuit, which is a federal circuit, and citing a decision there, Smith versus Gross, and held that the use of inherently factually contradictory theories violates the principles of due process. Okay. And then they say, such is the case here. Okay. So now before we go any further with this brief, what I want to do is I want to pull up those two cases, because we have these two cases, People versus Higley-Zuehlke, and we also have the earlier case, People versus Clark. And I think it's important, since we're right now, this is what these are the two cases that the judge is going to have to look to, according to the defense, to decide whether this problem of the prosecution bringing two contradictory theories with two different defendants, whether that's going to be an issue here. So we really have to look carefully at those two cases. So let's take a look at those two cases. First, we'll look at People versus Clark. Let me just pull it up here. People versus Clark. Here we go. This is a very short case, so we can read through the whole case pretty quickly. Defendant appeals as of right of his jury convictions. Okay, let's continue. This case arises from a dispute over a stolen gun. Throughout the day, and this is People versus Clark. This is what happened in this case. This is a Michigan case. So there's a dispute over a stolen gun. Throughout the day on June 19, 2008, Jasmine Thurman and Tequila Lewis had been feuding about a stolen gun. Finally, Jasmine went to Tequila's house armed with a baseball bat to confront Tequila about the gun. So she went to get this gun from Tequila, and she was going to convince her to do that, to give her the gun with a baseball bat. A large crowd gathered. Just as Jasmine swung the bat at Tequila, gunshots were fired. Jasmine was killed, and two of her friends were shot. Defendant Tequila's boyfriend, who was standing nearby, was charged with firing the shots that killed Jasmine and wounded two of her friends. So you have Tequila's boyfriend, who's the one who ultimately shot the gun, and he was found guilty. Tequila's brother, okay, so Tequila's a boyfriend who shot Jasmine when Jasmine was coming over there with a baseball bat. So you have Tequila's brother. You have Tequila's boyfriend who shot her. And then you have Tequila's brother. Tequila's brother, Demarius Lewis, admitted to firing an AK-47 out of an upstairs window with the intention of scaring the crowd of people, and pleaded guilty to associated charges in separate criminal proceedings. So Demarius Lewis's brother, he's upstairs in an upstairs by a window, and he's shooting an AK-47 just to scare the crowd of people. That's all he said that he was doing. On appeal, defendant argues that his right to due process was violated by the prosecution's use of inconsistent theories to convict him and his co-defendant, Demarius Lewis. So Demarius Lewis is the brother, and then this is the defendant, Clark, who is the boyfriend who actually shot Jasmine. So he's arguing that the prosecution here used inconsistent theories in order to convict him, and then also his co-defendant, Demarius Lewis. So he said, you can't do that. You can't, as a prosecutor, use inconsistent theories. Say the story is one way when it comes to convicting me, and then say the story is a different way when it comes to convicting Demarius Lewis. Well, guess what the Court of Appeals said? We disagree. This issue is unpreserved, therefore our review is limited to plain error affecting substantial rights. Okay. Defendant argues that he was denied due process by the prosecution's decision to take inconsistent positions in the prosecutions of him and Demarius Lewis. At Lewis's plea hearing, the prosecution argued that Lewis shot a gun out of the upstairs window. Okay, so at the hearing, the prosecution argued that Demarius Lewis did indeed shoot that gun out of the upstairs window. However, during closing argument at defendant's trial, the prosecutor asked the jury to believe a witness's testimony that inculpated defendant, but exculpated Lewis. So there's a witness that said, no. Demarius Lewis didn't shoot anything out of the window. And the only person that shot a gun was the boyfriend who eventually killed Jasmine. That is, a witness who positively identified defendant as the person who fired the shots that killed and injured the victims also testified that Lewis did not shoot a gun out of the upstairs window. So here you have the prosecutor saying in the plea hearing that yes, he did shoot a gun out of the window. And then during trial, in the closing arguments, They argued to the jury, believe this other, and this is the closing arguments of the defendant, the boyfriend, that they asked the jury to believe a witness who said that they saw Demarius Lewis, and Demarius Lewis did not shoot a gun out of the upstairs window. And therefore, the only person who could have shot a gun was who? The boyfriend. And therefore, obviously, the boyfriend was the one who murdered Jasmine. Thus, defendant argues the prosecution adopted inconsistent positions in the prosecutions of both men. Well, that certainly sounds contradictory. Well, what did the court hold? The court hold that that's fine. Michigan has not adopted the position that due process is violated when the prosecution offers factually contradictory theories during the prosecution of co-defendants. That is a quote from this case that we just read, which is defense. The defense is quoting that quote that we just read in his brief. However, in those jurisdictions which have adopted this position, so even though Michigan didn't really necessarily adopt this position that due process is violated when the prosecution offers contradictory theories, but even in those jurisdictions which did, it appears that due process was considered violated when mutually exclusive or factually contradictory theories were advanced against co-defendants charged with this exact same crime. In this case, however, so there's a distinction they're saying. They're saying even in those cases, there's still a distinction between in those cases and this specific case that we have in front of us. And this is important to know when you distinguish, because this is Michigan law. And Michigan law is saying we're not very liberal in our defining what does it mean factually contradictory theories. So they're much more conservative about this. So that's something that you have to understand. If you're the judge, we're much more conservative. We're not just going to say, it sounds contradictory, so then automatically there's a due process violation. So let's see what their distinction is. In this case, however, defendant and Lewis were not charged with the exact same crime. So they weren't charged with the same crime, right? Lewis was not charged with murder. I'm sorry. Demarius Lewis was not charged with murder. He was charged with shooting a gun out of the window, nothing to do with murder. So they weren't charged with the same exact crime. And mutually exclusive theories were not advanced against them. The prosecution never advocated the position that defendant and Lewis were guilty of the same crimes. The prosecution also maintained that defendant, from his position standing in the doorway on the porch, shot Jasmine and her two friends. Meaning the prosecution always maintained that the defendant here, the boyfriend, was the one who shot and killed Jasmine. The only question was, did Demarius Lewis shoot out of the window or not? But the prosecution never said that Lewis was the one who shot and killed Jasmine. So if the prosecution would have said in one trial, it was the boyfriend who shot and killed Jasmine, and then in another trial, they would say it wasn't the boyfriend, it was Lewis who shot and killed Jasmine. Well, then you'd have a problem. But here they're saying there's two different crimes here. They're not changing their facts. The facts are all the facts. I mean, the essential facts were who's the one who actually killed Jasmine. Prosecution always maintained that the defendant, from his position standing in the doorway on the porch, shot Jasmine and her two friends, and the prosecution never claimed that Lewis shot the victims. Rather, Lewis faced charges for shooting the AK-47 out of the upstairs window. Thus, even if Michigan were to adopt the position advanced by defendant, he would not prevail. Accordingly, this claim is without merit. So already you're starting to see that if it's not literally the same exact crime, and the theories are not completely contradictory to each other, then we will not apply this standard and say that there's a due process violation. Okay? Now, that is People versus Clark. So that's already helping us kind of how to think about this specific issue. So now let's see what the next case says. That was People versus Clark. Now let's pull up People versus, a funny last name. Just get the name right. People versus Higley-Zuehlke. All right. So I'm just jumping down to what happened because it's a lengthy factual lead up. So I'm not gonna read the entire background about what happened here. But what I will tell you is the following: that the question here was what actually killed the defendant? Was it a hammer? What killed the victim? Was it a hammer that was being smashed into the victim's skull, or was it a meat thermometer that was stabbed into the defendant? Okay, so these were kind of inconsistent theories that there was two different people there, and the prosecution used these two different theories to convict both of these people. Okay, so now let's see. Due process inconsistent theories. Defendant first alleges that her due process rights were violated when she and another person, Card, were convicted of murdering the same person on inconsistent theories. Okay, so again, we disagree. So here's another case where they're arguing this argument. Due process, the prosecution's using inconsistent theories, and in this case, it's actually that they're both charged with murder. And there was inconsistent theories that were used, right? So we're going to see if they were actually inconsistent or not. Now, I think that there's, usually I would skip over this, but I think there's something very interesting, a very, very interesting line that I think wouldn't hurt if a defense attorney wants to use this line in a closing argument. And this is what it says. The government's interest in conducting criminal prosecutions is not to merely obtain a conviction, but rather to see that justice shall be done. I think that's a great line if you want to start off your closing argument with that. Okay. The United States Court of Appeals for the Eighth Circuit has held that the use of inherently factually contradictory theories violates the principles of due process. In Smith, a witness made wholly inconsistent statements of what occurred during a home invasion. So this was this Smith case, which is the Eighth Circuit case, which they're talking about, which they're referencing, that has to do with a violation of a due process when you're using factually contradictory theories. What happened in that case? Well, a witness made wholly inconsistent statements of what occurred during a home invasion. In the first trial, with one co-defendant, the prosecution relied on the witness's statement that the victims were alive when the witness entered the home and that another co-defendant admitted to killing the victims. In the separate trial of a co-defendant, however, the prosecutor relied on the witness's contradictory statement that the victims were already dead when the witness arrived in the house. So you have contradictory statements by a witness whether people were alive when he came into the home. And they used one of the statements when it has to do with one trial, and the other contradictory statement when it had to do with a different trial. The court concluded, in short, what the state claimed to be true in the first case, it rejected in the second case and vice versa. This before/after distinction is the heart of the prosecutorial inconsistency that allowed the state to convict as many defendants as possible in a series of cases in which the question of timing was crucial. So in those cases, the question of timing was crucial. Who was alive when exactly did everything happen? And they're using the same witness and two different statements that witness said in different trials, and they were contradictory statements. Accordingly, the use of inherently factually contradictory theories violates the principles of due process. The court noted that the situation presented was unusual and unlikely to occur often. The court stressed that such inconsistencies to constitute a due process violation must exist at the core of the prosecutor's cases against defendants for the same crime. So it has to exist at the core of the case. It has to be so material to get a conviction in both cases. That's when we find that if you use contradictory theories, which drive home the core of the case, that's when there's going to be a due process violation. Finally, the court declined to conclude that prosecutors must present precisely the same evidence and theories in trials for different defendants. Okay, so that was the Eighth Circuit course. That was the federal case which Michigan is using to help its own jurisprudence to decide what are we going to decide about this issue about contradictory theories. In the instant case, defendant contends that her due process rights were violated because the prosecutor presented two inconsistent theories, one at her trial with her killing the victim, and a different one at Card's trial with Card responsible for the killing, which resulted in convictions of both individuals for the same crime. So this is much more problematic than the earlier case of People versus Clark, right? Here you have people charged with the same exact crime for killing the same exact person, but contradictory theories. Who killed the person? In Card's case, they said Card was the one who killed the victim. And in her case, in this specific case, they allege that she killed the victim. The prosecutor commenced closing arguments by generally stating that the defendant was involved in the murder before providing more detailed arguments. So they quote here the closing argument of the prosecutor, where the prosecutor said that she was involved in the case, in the murder. Not specifically exactly what she did, but she was absolutely involved in the murder. Okay. Additionally, the prosecutor argued to the jury that the defendant did not merely find the victim at his home, but she murdered him, left his body there, lied to cover up her role in the murder, and removed evidence to prevent being held accountable. And again, during rebuttal, the prosecutor added, maybe Robert Card did do it. I never said the defendant was the getaway driver. She was there. She was involved when he was struck in the back of the head. She struck him in the back of the head, and she got rid of the hammer. That did it again. She was the one that used the hammer. Card was the one who used the meat thermometer. That did it, and she had the time and she had the opportunity to do it. So if you really want to get a good picture of exactly what happened in this case, go back and read everything that happened up until this case. But I just kind of summarized it for you so we won't be here all day. There is no doubt she committed the murder of John Allen. At Card's trial several months later, the same prosecutor made the following arguments. The instrument that, okay, so now this is the statements that the prosecutor made at Card's trial. The instrument the DNA was found on, combined with the testimony from Dr. Daniel Spitz, the medical examiner, the testimony is going to establish for you the murder weapon in this case was a meat thermometer. So what was the murder weapon in Card's trial? It was the meat thermometer, which Card used. What was the murder weapon in this defendant's trial? That was the hammer. This defendant, Card, had opportunity, this defendant had means, and this defendant left his DNA behind. Why? Because this defendant killed John Allen. John Allen died as a result of being strangled. Contributory causes being the puncture wound through the ear and blunt trauma to the head. In the end, the evidence will be very clear to you that Robert Card did in fact kill John Allen, and he did in fact intend to kill him. So this is all in Card's trial. When Card comes home, he comes out of the bathroom, he's going like with this, with his hands, okay, etc., etc. All right. So now, we conclude that the differing arguments in the two cases do not constitute a constitutional violation. So you hear what's going on here? Very, very different than People versus Clark. Here you have literally the argument, the prosecutor making the argument that in one case, Card was the killer, essentially. And in the other case, they were arguing that Card was not the killer. It was actually the girl that was the killer. We're using a hammer. We conclude that the differing arguments in the two cases do not constitute a constitutional violation. During closing argument, a prosecutor is entitled to argue all the facts and evidence and all reasonable inferences arising from those facts as they relate to a prosecutor's theory of the case. In defendant's trial, the prosecutor contended that she murdered the victim by first incapacitating him with strikes from a hammer and then causing the victim's death by strangling him with her hands, knee, or foot. Okay, pretty gruesome. The prosecutor further submitted that the defendant removed the hammer from the crime scene and not the meat thermometer because it correlated her to the victim's death, meaning when she left the crime scene, she took the hammer with her. She left the meat thermometer because she didn't have anything to do with the meat thermometer, so she just left it there. According to the prosecutor, the meat thermometer was irrelevant because it was not the instrumentality that the defendant used to cause the victim's death. But in Card's trial, the prosecutor asserted that Card was the one who murdered the victim because the murder weapon was the meat thermometer. Both of these theories were within the realm of the evidence proffered by the medical examiner, Dr. Spitz. So they're saying, this is what the Court of Appeals is saying, is that both of these theories actually fit within the evidence. That the meat thermometer killed him and the victim, and it also fits to say that the hammer killed him. Both of the theories fit within the evidence and that was proffered by the medical examiner. Although a single murder of the victim occurred, there were puncture and blunt trauma wounds to the back and front of the body, indicating that multiple sharp instruments were used. Dr. Spitz could not definitively delineate the manner in which the wounds occurred or the impact on the brain because of the degree of decomposition when the victim was discovered. So Dr. Spitz also had a problem with saying exactly what caused the ultimate, last murder, the last wound that actually murdered the victim. However, Dr. Spitz surmised that the blunt force trauma wounds seemingly occurred first to incapacitate the victim and to allow the puncture wound from the meat thermometer. Moreover, the jury was instructed that the defendant could be convicted premised on an aiding and abetting theory. In light of the multiple instruments used, the various traumatic wounds inflicted all over the victim's body, and the aiding and abetting theory presented to the jury, we cannot conclude that the prosecutor relied on inconsistent theories and deprived defendant of due process of law. Rather, the theories in these cases were legally consistent in light of the medical evidence. A consistent theory in both cases from the arguments made is that defendant attacked the victim with a hammer before strangling him. Additionally, the prosecution theorized that Card was present and fought with the victim and beat him while this occurred. Arguably, the victim was rendered incapacitated by the blunt force trauma from a hammer, and that incapacitation allowed Card to stab the victim in the ear with the meat thermometer. Notably, although Dr. Spitz opined that strangulation was the actual cause of death, he also testified that the stabbing through the ear was a contributory cause of the death. Accordingly, just jumping to the end here, accordingly, the prosecutor was permitted to argue that both defendant and Card acted as the principal murderer in their respective cases. This does not make the theories inconsistent or deprive defendant of due process of law. So what here the court is saying, that as long as the evidence supports the theory in which the prosecutor is using on each individual defendant, the prosecutor could technically argue contradictory theories, because as long as the evidence supports what the argument that you're making to the jury is, then you could use contradictory theories. So here is an extremely liberal view of what the prosecutor is allowed to do. And again, this is Michigan law. Okay, and this is what the judge has to use to base her argument. So it's not looking so great for Jennifer Crumbley, right? So let's come back before we finish the analysis. Let's come back and see what the defense is going to argue using these cases, why Jennifer Crumbley should be acquitted, because it's contradictory theories. So let's bring back their motion, and here we go. Okay, so this is about where we stopped, right? Yeah. In this instance, the core theory of criminal liability against Mrs. Crumbley is that she failed to control her minor child so as to prevent the minor child from intentionally harming others or prevent the minor child from conducting themselves in a way that creates an unreasonable risk of bodily harm to others. While the prosecution argued that Mrs. Crumbley had a duty to prevent her minor child from harming others, the prosecutor charged Mrs. Crumbley's son as an adult and argued that he had planned the murders for months, such that he should be held accountable as an adult, and argued for a sentence of life without parole. The shooter cannot be deemed a child for purposes of Mrs. Crumbley's criminal liability, while at the same time treating him as an adult for purposes of his own prosecution. These are mutually exclusive, factually contradictory theories of liability, which allowed the state to convict as many defendants as possible in a series of cases. So they're using quotes from Higley-Zuehlke and People versus Clark to help their case, which is, again, good brief writing. This is what you want to do. But if you actually look at those cases seem to be a very, very liberal about what the prosecutor is allowed to do. And when exactly does it fit for there to be considered contradictory theories and then a violation of due process? It's very, very narrow. Seems to be how Michigan law is interpreting this up until this point. But still, they're trying to use quotes that will help them. Continuing. Such blatantly inconsistent theories of prosecution implicate the due process concerns raised by the courts. During the shooter's Miller hearing, the prosecutor downplayed the allegations that her office was prosecuting the shooter and his parents under inconsistent theories. And this is a quote. There has been a misconception that charging this defendant as an adult and charging his parents is somehow inconsistent. That is not true. They are charged for two different things. Now, does that make a difference if they're charged for two different things? Well, we did see in People versus Clark that the fact that they were not charged with two of the same exact crimes definitely helped the Michigan court say that there's going to be no problem there of due process. So the fact that they're being charged with two different crimes, and there are two different crimes here, involuntary manslaughter versus what the shooter was charged with, first-degree murder and terrorism. And this is a direct quote from the prosecution, Miller hearing. In this instance, the prosecution's assertion is one of form over substance. Okay, so they're arguing, they're charged for two different things. That's just form over substance. As one jurist aptly noted, the state cannot divide and conquer in this manner. Such actions reduce criminal trials to mere gamesmanship and rob them of the supposed purpose of a search for truth. Now, remember what I told you about brief writing when we discussed this on other videos. When you want to show that what the prosecutor is arguing here does not fit within the case law, and you actually have cases that really help you, what you'll do is you'll show the cases and you'll bring in detail why those cases stand for the proposition that is an opposite to what the prosecutor is arguing here. If you just say, this is not true, and you just bring a quote from a case like this, what they're doing here, then it's not as strong. It's just not as strong because, well, let's go see what happened in that case. As we saw ourselves with just this video specifically, when you actually go and see what the factual scenario of those cases are and what happened in those cases, and then why the courts are coming out a certain way and what their analysis is, it gives you a much better picture of when you apply the law and in what context. So when you just say a quote, we notice this sometimes with the Sarah Boone motions for a new trial. They'll say, yeah, they messed up because of this, and they'll just cite a case, or they'll just, one small quote from a case. Anyway, let's continue. As one jurist aptly noted, the state cannot divide and conquer in this manner. And again, what manner are they talking about? This is Drake versus Kemp. What manner? What are the situation there? Is it similar to this situation? Is it not similar to this situation? Such actions reduce criminal trials to mere gamesmanship and rob them of their supposed purpose of a search for truth. Well, what happened here? What happened in Drake versus Kemp that you're quoting this case and you're saying that they cannot divide and conquer in this manner? I would assume that what they're talking about two inconsistent theories. Well, if they're talking about two inconsistent theories, what exactly happened in that case that's inconsistent? What happened? What specifically happened? And then show how that's exactly what they're trying to do here. But when you don't do that, then right away you start thinking, I wonder if I look up that case, Drake versus Kemp, and I didn't do that right now, but I'm going to give you guys a little bit of homework as well. But if you go look up that case, I wonder if it's going to be the same exact situation that we have here, because something tells me that it's not exactly the same. But let's continue. Here, the prosecution has charged 3 individuals for the same murders that were committed by the Crumbley son. The obvious inconsistency is in the prosecution's theories is demonstrated by the fact that it wishes for the shooter to be viewed in the eyes of the law as an adult. But as to the charges of involuntary manslaughter, the prosecution is arguing that Mrs. Crumbley is responsible for the same murders committed by her son because he was a minor child and she failed to control him. When the prosecution advances a position in the trial of one defendant and then adopts an inconsistent position in the trial of another on the same facts, the prosecution is relying on a known falsity. To allow the prosecution to do so corrupts the process. And here, quoting from Prosecutorial Inconsistency, okay, this is a law review. So not exactly a case, not such binding authority, but a nice quote for them anyway. The inconsistency then is that Mrs. Crumbley's son, who committed the murders, is being treated both as a child and as an adult for purposes of the same murders. In short, what the state claimed to be true in one case, it rejected in the other case. Again, People versus Higley-Zuehlke. And that was the case that we went through. The inconsistency is not cured by the mere fact that the shooter was charged with murder while his parents were charged with manslaughter. So, again, they're trying to attack this idea that just because they're charged with different crimes, that doesn't completely give you a freedom as a prosecutor to use contradictory theories. Regardless of how the prosecutor's ethical duty is defined, courts should not permit the prosecution to convict a defendant on one theory and then pursue an inconsistent theory to win a guilty verdict against a second defendant charged on the basis of the same criminal episode. And again, this is a law review article. The due process concerns arising from inconsistent prosecution theories is not tied exclusively to whether 2 or more persons are charged with the same exact crime. While that may be the most common scenario under which courts have found due process violations, that is not the only instance that implicates due process concerns. Rather, the court must look at whether the prosecution presents factually contradictory theories of liability against more than one individual arising from the same event. Despite the differing charges as between the shooter and his parents, the prosecution presented factually inconsistent, mutually exclusive theories during the separate proceedings. This inconsistency resulted in the denial of Mrs. Crumbley's right to due process and a fair trial. Because this inconsistency cannot be cured, Mrs. Crumbley is entitled to a judgment of acquittal. So that is this section of the argument, why Mrs. Crumbley should have never been charged in this case, because you can't say that the same person is a minor and an adult. Now, we have to understand, what does it mean that the shooter was treated as an adult as opposed to a minor, and whether at that specific hearing, because that's what they represent, because the prosecution was arguing that he should not be considered a minor in that context, does that mean that it's contradictory theory to then charge the Crumbleys with not controlling their minor child? And what do I mean by that? Well, we have to understand the hearing that they're talking about. They're talking about a hearing, a Miller hearing. And that hearing, that's when they discuss whether this shooter, if he's a minor, should be treated as an adult or a minor. And why is that important? Well, what happened in Miller is that it's a case of Miller versus Arizona. And in that case, let me just remove this and I'll pull up the quote to that case of Miller versus Arizona, because this is what Michigan has adopted. This is called People versus Taylor, and it's quoting Miller. So Miller versus Arizona said the following, that there is an Eighth Amendment problem with a mandatory life without the possibility of parole sentence for a minor. What's the Eighth Amendment? The Eighth Amendment it protects you from cruel and unusual punishment. Okay, so this is how the Michigan courts quote this case called Miller. Okay, the Eighth Amendment of the United States Constitution prohibits cruel and unusual punishments, guaranteeing individuals the right not to be subjected to excessive sanctions. Further, a basic precept of justice requires that punishment be proportionate to both the offense and the offender. The United States Supreme Court has thus held that juvenile offenders are constitutionally different from adult offenders for purposes of sentencing. They are less deserving of the most severe punishments because of their diminished culpability and increased prospects for reform. I mean, because they're such a child, so they don't have as much culpability. They shouldn't be as responsible for their actions. And number two is that they also have a lot more of the capability to be reformed and be changed. If you have someone who's 30 years old and commits a heinous crime, then the guy's already 30. You know, he's probably pretty much set in his ways. And of course, no one's beyond reform, but you have much less sympathy for that person that, oh, maybe he'll get better and reform. And then it's just shame that he's just sitting in prison, as opposed to a child who's so young and they haven't really matured properly, and their brain hasn't completely matured. And it's much more of a reason to argue that they would be reformed and not to just lock them up for the rest of their life because of something they did when they were so young. So that's what. In Miller, therefore, the United States Supreme Court held that the Eighth Amendment prohibits mandatory life without the possibility of parole sentences for crimes committed when the offender was under 18 years old. Miller also set forth factors that a trial court should consider before concluding that it is appropriate to sentence a juvenile offender to die in the prison for a homicide offense. Okay, so what Miller did was that Miller said, we don't want to automatically have life without parole sentences for minors. So therefore, what has to happen is that if the prosecution wants to go for a sentence of life without parole for a minor, they have to have this Miller hearing. And in the Miller hearing, that is when they set forth the factors. That's when they discuss the factors that a trial court should consider before concluding that it is an appropriate sentence. It's appropriate sentence, life without parole for a juvenile offender. Okay, so these are the factors that you're supposed to take into consideration. And this was the Miller hearing that they're talking about, that the prosecution argued that the shooter should be charged as an adult. So number one, the juvenile's chronological age and its hallmark features, among them immaturity, impetuosity, and failure to appreciate risks and consequences. 2, the juvenile's family and home environment. 3, the circumstances of the homicide offense, including the extent of the juvenile's participation in the conduct and the way familiar and peer pressure may have affected the juvenile. 4, the incompetencies of youth, which affect whether the juvenile might have been charged with and convicted of a lesser crime. For example, because the juvenile did not have the capacity to assist their attorney in their own defense. And 5, the juvenile's possibility of rehabilitation. These factors have been expressly incorporated into the state's discretionary juvenile life without parole sentencing scheme under MCL 769.25. So that is really, this is just Michigan courts, People versus Taylor, adopting Miller and telling us what the factors that should be discussed during a Miller hearing are. And that's exactly what happened. So in that hearing, that's when the prosecutor argued that the shooter should be considered an adult for sentencing purposes, right? So for his sentencing purposes, that's what they're arguing, that he's mature enough and he planned this, and the possibility of reform and all those factors they went through, and the prosecution argued that he should be treated like an adult. Now the question is, let's say they did argue that should be considered an adult for sentencing purposes. Does that automatically mean that because the law will view him as an adult when it comes to sentencing purposes, does that automatically mean that the parents of this child have no more responsibility in terms of how they can control their child? There's a certain element of control that you can have over your child who's a minor child, even if the child is an extremely mature individual, even if the child can understand right and wrong. There still is an innate responsibility that a parent can have over their child. So what I'm saying is it's a very compelling argument to make. But if you think about it in the context of, for sentencing purposes, it's different than a theory to convict the person in the first place. It's just an argument about whether the person is going to be life without parole or not, whether he's going to be eligible for parole or not. And that's the only argument. And you're arguing these specific factors to argue that therefore he should be treated as an adult when it comes to sentencing. So does that mean now that because you're treating him as an adult, therefore it's completely contradictory to the idea that the parents can still have some sort of responsibility to control their minor child? That's all I'm bringing up, that it's still possible to argue on behalf of the prosecution that it doesn't matter. It's not really inherently contradictory. The fact that we're treating him for sentencing purposes as an adult, that he reached a certain level of maturity to still appreciate and understand his actions and all the different factors, we're going to argue that he still should be treated like an adult under the law when it comes to sentencing. Does that automatically mean that therefore the parents don't have any responsibility to that child anymore? So this is most likely, I imagine, the prosecution is going to argue some sort of argument like this, that it's not really even contradictory. So number one, they're going to argue it's two different crimes. And like we saw from the case law, when it's two different crimes, there's really no inherent problem of arguing two contradictory theories. So that's what they're first going to argue. It's involuntary manslaughter versus first-degree murder and terrorism. Now, also, they can argue that this other argument that I made, that it's not really a contradiction. That's another argument that they can make, and we'll see. Maybe they'll make some other arguments as well, because again, it's not just about whether they're charged with two crimes either. That you can acknowledge as well. Although the People versus Clark seem that was a very strong factor in their favor. And again, in that other case, People versus, I forgot that funny case. In that case, they were charged with the same exact crime. And still, Michigan courts found that it was still okay to argue two contradictory theories. Now, if the courts find that once you say that this kid is an adult, then therefore it's automatically contradictory to argue that this kid is a minor, and therefore they're contradictory theories, then I can start to understand, I can start to hear that maybe the courts will find that you can't go ahead with these two theories, once with the child and once with the parent. But like I said, it seems to be that from Michigan law, it's very liberal in what a prosecutor is allowed to argue to the jury. And therefore, I can see how this is not going to go down in Jennifer Crumbley's favor. There's some other arguments that they brought up in that motion, which I think definitely have some merit. But this one, I'm not sure if it's actually going to go anywhere. It's a very interesting, it's a very compelling argument, but I think once you actually see what the law has to say about it, it's not as compelling anymore. And especially, I think that last exercise that we did together about whether the child is considered an adult for sentencing purposes, does that mean that automatically there should be no more responsibility of a parent over that child? I'm not sure if that has to go hand in hand. So that's just another thought of mine. Well, that's going to be it for now. If you have tuned in, thank you very much. If you haven't yet, please subscribe, like, and we will see you next time.